my clock, telling me I should get up. I should get up.
Hi, and welcome to The Conscious Loop, where woo-woo and the real world collide. I'm your host, Katrina DeAngelis. Join me as we explore what it looks like to live consciously almost always. Each episode, we dive into transforming mindsets and shifting paradigms through topics such as developing self-awareness, living authentically, communication, strengthening relationships, and leading from the inside out. If you're ready to break out of your unconscious loops and discover what else is possible, you came to the right place. You ready? Let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to The Conscious Loop. I am so excited to have here on the show one of my friends, colleagues, and collaborators that I get to work with very often for the past few years. So I'm excited to bring her wisdom to the table and give you a little taste of what she has to share within the space of strengths-based leadership, conscious and crucial conversations, seeking intent versus impact, and really just how that allows you to have more fulfilling, safer conversations with those around you, whether it's your partner, your team members. You know, we're all influenced by relationships. And really, this is the work that Maddie and I facilitate together. So I'm just really excited to be bringing some of that wisdom to you today. If you're curious about any strength-based leadership assessments, tools, or any coaching, please do follow up and let us know how we can support or follow up for a free assessment after the show. Maddie, so amazing to see you and so great to have you here on the show. I'm so excited. I've been waiting for this interview since I launched the podcast to share with my audience and just share with the world some of, what we talk about all the time, which is relationship intelligence, communication, how our strengths play a role in our daily lives, in conflict, in interactions, in personal relationships, and all of these things that we're constantly in relationship with ourselves, with somebody else, with our team. And so I am so excited to dive into that a little bit here today. But before I do that, I'll have you introduce yourself to our audience.
Wonderful. Katrina, so good to see you. It's always good to see you. And I always look forward to these conversations that we have about relationships because you and I have been doing that for a little while now. So honored to be on this. And yeah, I've always been interested in the power of communication and the power of understanding why people show up the way they do in relationships and how sometimes we get in our own way, right? In creating that productivity of relationships. And so that interest, how when you're interested in something, sometimes things come to you. And I remember somebody introducing me to the SDI, and I thought, you know what? This is a really cool way of putting a framework around how I can shift the way I see people's behaviors and understand that what I see is not always what is driving people, why people do what they do. And so ever since I've been using this tool, what it has done for me, it has put me in a position where I can actually pause, reflect on who are you? And I think the fundamental shift for me has been, and this is hard to believe because I'm still working at it, because what did I hear the other day? That I'm a human being in construction, under construction. But what it forces me to really think about is, am I more interested in somebody, or at this moment, am I fueled by the need to be interesting? And I know that whenever I want to be interested in people, whenever I lean into curiosity, I find so much more about people, about what drives them, what matters to them. And then by doing that, then I can extend dignity, to others and respect, because then they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel like they're not needing to protect their intent because the person who's actually listening to them is paying attention and really wants to know, what's important to them about things. So whenever I act out of the place of wanting to be interesting, it doesn't work so well because then it's more
I
about,
love that.
yeah.
Being interesting or interested. That's
Mhm.
so powerful. And I'm curious, because a part of that is shifting from self to other when you're in relationship and when you're in a dynamic with someone or a conversation and getting out. You mentioned getting out of our own way.
Mhm.
What do you think goes into relationship intelligence and relationship dynamics, because on one hand you mentioned being interested in somebody else and curious and less interesting, but how does knowing yourself and self-awareness also play a role in being able to show up in that way for a relationship dynamic?
Well, the way I like to look at it and the way it really helps. So, and I'll ask this of you, Katrina. Think of a time where you have used a strength that you like to use, right? So, I've known you for many years now to be a person who is caring and helpful to others, right? And really wanting to be able to provide value to them. Just look at what you're doing with this podcast, right? Bringing it out there, getting people to think about their unconscious loops. Has it ever been a time where you are so, you are being helpful and caring to somebody that you forgot to acknowledge the fact that maybe, just maybe, that strength didn't come across the way it was intended? In other words, has it ever been a time where you were so caring or so helpful that you actually create the opposite reaction in somebody, right? Rather than being open to receiving, they kind of close down.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. I'm thinking back to probably one of my career mistakes early on, and I feel like in your career, it's you have so many opportunities to kind of see these aspects because you run into so many different types of people and personalities and all of that. And I remember when I first started learning about the SDI and relationship intelligence, I was so over supportive and overbearing in a specific scenario that got me into trouble. And I was so confused. I couldn't actually see or understand how somebody could be upset at me because I was so in my own way from my own intent of like, I was doing something good. I was trying to be nice. I was trying to be helpful. I was trying to be supportive, which are all things that I've always gotten positive feedback from in the past. So I think it's
Mhm.
almost like that first point of tension or conflict that also probably woke me up to, okay, supportive, caring, not always going to be helpful, and to seek to understand rather than react because I was mad. I
Mhm.
was mad,
Mhm.
and so I really had
Yeah.
to, like you said, yeah, get myself out of my own way to be curious enough to understand somebody else's perspective and not need to be heard because I did find myself going into, well, I was trying to do this and I was trying to be helpful and I was trying to do that, and I'm not interested or I wasn't interested in really understanding how that could have been perceived because I couldn't see beyond my own experience in that
Yeah.
moment. That was a huge
Yeah.
lesson.
And so that's exactly when we talk about relationship intelligence, right? Is the same way that, I remember early on in my life when, I was using confidence, and I had to lean into confidence a lot, the way I grew up and the things that I've had to deal with. Confident is a go-to. And I never understood when somebody would look at me and says, "Well, you're a little intimidating." And I'm going, "Intimidating?" And I would go straight into that unconscious loop of defending myself and going, "Intimidation is not my problem. You're the one that's too sensitive." Right? And so I would tend to accuse others of not understanding my intent or the strength at play. And when we do that, what we do is we create disconnection, to use Brene Brown's words around, we disconnect from that relationship because we're more interested in proving to the other person that, no, that's not me. I'm not like that. That's your problem. That's the way you see it. So, relationship intelligence, using it, allows me now to step back and say, interesting. Intimidation is a function of the impact of a strength on somebody else. So, even though I might be very, very motivated, and the reason why I'm doing it is is really to demonstrate confidence in what I believe. If it's coming across as intimidation, what's the likelihood that I'll build a solid relationship or that the person will even consider another perspective, right? They've shut down now because now it's like too much of a good thing. So
Mm.
the way that we can get out of our own way is just by becoming aware of the fact that even though my intent is to persuade you of a great idea, if I come across to you as intimidating, I need to be able to take ownership for that strength and say, how can I either diminish the volume of that strength? In other words, lower it, the tone a little bit around that so that you stay in a conversation with me. Right. So
Mm.
instead of intimidation, I would say, what I've realized is sometimes I don't, I tend to interrupt and to keep talking without really asking what you think. So let me just ask you, what are your thoughts around this? Right. And so, yeah, I shift the ratio of telling about my story to be more interested in the other person's perspective on that same story. And that kind of diminishes that intimidation. So, unconsciously, we tend to defend ourselves through our intent, but we really, really have to become aware of the fact that intent is only half the picture. The other half is impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that intent versus impact. And, we kind of are speaking to this right now, but just for the audience to have a deeper understanding, how does intent versus impact show up? And how does that relate to strengths and overdone strengths? And how might somebody begin to become aware of, both you and I shared a story of realizing how some of our strengths were maybe tipping into being unhelpful. How might somebody become aware of somebody else's experience to understand when their intent is possibly actually not being received, and you can and start to notice that impact?
Hmm. Start noticing the impact. Well, you've got to become more observant of people's behaviors. I remember having an experience with my daughter when she was very young. She was given the gift, she was given a scooter, and she was young. And I always looked at her as a go getter. Claudia, she was young and she was very much motivated by this is fun. This is going to be adventure. I'm going to get on my scooter. I'm going to go places. But my first concern was, she's so adventurous and so willing to, do it, that is she going to be cautious enough? So I came across to her as, instead of her perceiving my intent as wanting to be protective, I came across as punishment, right? That I told her, I said, no, you're not going to do that because, and I used very strong language. And she looked at me and it was like, you're being a bully. You're just bullying me, mom. And I was going, I'm not bullying you. I'm going to make sure that you're safe at all times. But it was not being perceived as being safe, right? And so if it's not being perceived as being safe, I could have at that moment said, you know what? You're right. The way this is coming across is this. And here's my intent. Where I really, really am drawing is, I am so afraid right now. I am so afraid of thinking of you on a moped, and I'm actually putting that on you, right? But hear me out. I need to make absolutely sure that you're confident and able when you ride that moped. Had I been able to take accountability for how I was showing up in that behavior and put my intent at the forefront, not as an excuse, but as context, right? It gives people an insight into why you're doing what you're doing. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It just gives people context. And then once people have context, it creates more potentially of an opportunity for people to express how they are perceiving that strength, right?
Mm,
But if people
yeah,
understand that it comes from a place of help, it doesn't make it right, but it just says to the person, you know what? I'm really fueled by fear right now. And it creates a better understanding that you can re-enter into dialogue rather than going into a conflictual discussion, right?
mhm.
When we tend to accuse people of things that it's not their intent, you force them to defend their intent. And when people are in defense mode, chances are you're no longer having a conversation. You're having a debate over who's right and who's wrong.
Oh, yeah, I feel that.
Right?
That's definitely, been a part of my journey for sure, and I'm curious, when it comes to that, like, getting defensive,
Yeah.
how can we shift? Because what I see happen for myself and the people I work with, but also just in my personal life,
Yeah.
is if I feel like I move into defending my intent,
Mhm.
it actually the other person doesn't feel heard. So I feel like I'm
Right.
trying so hard to be heard, but then I'm dismissing somebody else's intent and somebody else how what they maybe need to hear or feel or
Mhm.
experience. And so how do you what are some ways we can mitigate that in the moment? Like, how can we
Mhm.
almost remove ourselves from needing to be defensive or feeling the need to, be louder or say more or do whatever it is and really listen and understand and shift really? Because that's the biggest part. It's like it's shifting because once you get into defense mode, it's very challenging. And so what are some ways people can shift?
Yeah. What's really interesting is, and I'm going to use a visual to show it, right? If I'm having a conversation with you, right, and all of a sudden you feel the need to defend your intent, you're going to push back, right? You're going to push. And when you start pushing back and I start defending my need to defend my intent, we're locked in, right? And nobody's budging because we're both coming from a perspective of defense. The minute I let go and I recognize, and if I name your intent, and instead of using but, and you did a beautiful podcast on this in one of the episodes where you talked about the difference between but and. So if I were to look at you and say, Katrina, I see that in this situation, you're really excited about your scooter, right? You really want to be able to drive that scooter. And you know, I and I'm perceiving as well that that excitement to me translates sometimes in maybe not being as careful as you could be, right? Because you might not pay attention to some things. So, how can I make sure that that excitement is still there and that I have that ability to say, yes, you're going to be more cautious right around that. But if I say to somebody, you're not being cautious. Why can't you be more cautious? You're not being responsible. Why can't you do this? It's a very different conversation. Push, push, we're not budging, right? Whereas if I let go and I say, who doesn't want to have fun with a scooter? Like, I don't like, of course you want to have fun. The minute you recognize somebody's intent and you give them feedback on the impact of that strength on you, on your team, on your organization, then people feel less of a need to push back because they felt heard, they felt seen, and they feel understood. And you invite them back into the conversation, into the fold. They no longer feel the need to defend their intent. So I'll say something to you like, Katrina, I one of the things I appreciate the most about you is how caring you are. And sometimes that caring comes across to me as it kind of cancels out my need to expand, right? Because I'm okay doing that. And I'm recognizing your intent and I'm giving you feedback on what I need from you.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And I hear, a lot of vulnerability. Like it takes vulnerability because, on one hand, if you were to say, for the example with your daughter and the scooter, don't do that, that's dangerous. It's still coming from a place of fear
Care.
and
Yeah.
protection, but it's control.
Yeah.
And nobody likes to feel or be controlled. And
Mhm.
so it takes vulnerability and owning your fears or what's going on underneath the surface to actually shift to a dialogue and the
Yeah.
collaborative and co-created conversation that can ultimately lead to a positive mutual agreement and understanding. And I
Yeah.
think that's the hardest part for me anyways, is the hardest part, and it takes that vulnerability, but it also takes recognizing the fear, because sometimes we don't even want to admit it to ourselves that there is
Yeah.
something going on beneath the surface,
Mhm.
and so really doing that
Mhm.
inner work and that digging a little bit deeper to see what's happening.
Mhm.
So, so beautiful. And so, how what are some ways when you think about the people you work with and also in your own life and the people that you're coaching or even workshops that you're doing where you're working with the SDI, what are really common themes that people struggle with, either as a leader or in
Mhm.
relationship with anyone that they're close with? And I say close because the closer you are or the more you need from somebody, whether it be somebody that you work directly with, a daughter, a partner, a sister, whatever it is, the more you feel like you need from somebody, the more opportunity for conflict to arise because there's more importance in that relationship. So what are
Right.
some themes that you see from people that you work with?
Yeah, that's such a big question, right? As human beings, I mean, and I don't want to generalize, but oftentimes we're kind of wired for judgment and wired for selective kind of looking at the situation from our own lens and from our own perception, right? Because it fits into our model of the world and what we expect from others. And I think the mental shift that is required, to your point, being vulnerable is not an easy activity, is not an easy skill. It requires your ability to recognize that um, people show up in different ways. And rather than judging, what if we stayed open and what if we looked at them as full humans that, have are driven by things that are very different from what we're driven by and not expect them or not judge them based on it. So that's a little bit esoteric over here. But if I bring it down to practicality in everyday conversations, what it allows me to do is I believe that before you can use a skill, you've got to be able to be in the right mindset. And what relationship intelligence allows people to do, whether it's leaders or team members or family members, is to what if you were to adopt what we call positive regard in your interactions with others? And that is that you bring in the mindset of people are trying to do the right thing for the most part when they enter into a relationship with somebody else. And when they are trying to do the right thing, then if I extend to them positive regard, I remember reading a beautiful blog written by Seth Godin, and he talked about it was a short thing and talked about kindness. And he mentioned that there are three types of kindness: the kindness of yeah, please and thank you, the kindness of I'm sorry, I messed up and I'll do better, or I take responsibility for this. But the one that really struck me was the kindness of dignity. And the kindness of dignity is why not give people the benefit of the doubt? Why not assume that they're trying to do the right thing? And if when we shift our mind to looking at people and saying, people are trying to do the right thing, then it allows you to look at their behavior and say, what am I perceiving in this? How can I look at this from a different perspective? Instead of looking at somebody and saying, boy, they're stubborn, what if I look at the strength instead and say, this person believes in this so much that they're persevering in their opinion around something? The minute I think of it differently, then I can do different, because what it allows me to access is empathy. It allows me to access understanding. It allows me to access kindness, right? Where I do not have access to that when I look at somebody and go, stop being so annoyingly stubborn. You're just being stubborn. And when people start making those, you know, when they start creating that belief system around people, and that's what happens, the closer people are to you, the more you tend to cast that belief in every interaction that you have with that person, right? And it starts kind of filtering in everything that they do based on what you've already created as an opinion, as a judgment. And so sometimes it's harder. The closer you are to people, it's harder to move out from that, you know, that set mindset and looking at people from a very different perspective. I'm not sure if that answered your question, or maybe it was a long about way to going at it, but stopping and recognizing and providing positive intent to what people do allows you to access so many other things in you, right? In the way that you show up to others.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's so powerful because what I'm also hearing there is we spend so much time wanting to get a point across or to be
Mhm.
heard or to be understood or to share our perspective. But if we can, even just for a moment, start to practice putting that same energy into understanding somebody else's perspective rather
Mm.
than needing to be heard, that's where it all unravels. Because if somebody is heard and you're
Yeah.
putting that work in to understand somebody else's intent, just as how you would yourself, like giving somebody else that same, like you said, benefit of the doubt and opportunity to be understood, that is a gift not only to the other person, but to the relationship and to that space in between. And so, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
But the one thing though is that, that's why the importance of self-care and self-compassion, because if you're not in a good state of mind, if you're not in a good place, if you are tired, I know that when I tend to be overly tired, I tend to go into judgment a lot quicker, right? And there's a sense of impatience and intolerance that sets in. But instead of laying that out to the world and saying it's this fault, it's over here, I look within and go, what do I need? What am I not taking care of here that will allow me to stay present and allow me to stay focused, and then allow me to lean to really look at kindness rather than accusation, or rather than finger pointing, or rather than saying you did this, right? I'd much rather look at that and say, I don't like that, and here's why. Right? I don't like it. And
Mhm.
so when it comes to setting limits, creating boundaries, it's so much easier. I don't want to get the misconception that, just because people are trying to do the right thing means that I need to like everything that people do. I don't. There are a lot of things that people do that I don't like. There are a lot of things that people do that have an impact on the way that my fundamental values and the way I think. Rather than accusing them of not being like me, what if I start demonstrating a lot more curiosity and listening and seeking to really understand and not judge their perspective. And I think that when you do that, you might not agree, but you don't need to be in conflict with that human being, right? You might just look at him and say, okay, you know what? Thanks for sharing that perspective. And here's a different perspective that I hold in everyday conversations. Can you imagine how much easier our lives would be if we just looked at someone and said, so what I'm hearing you say is you're trying to do this. Yes, of course. Okay. Here's how that has having an impact on me right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Honoring both, right? Like you said,
Ordering both.
not
Yeah.
about, "Oh, you did this, but I feel this." Like, one doesn't take away the other, both are valid,
No.
and so how do you create the space for both? And I love what you said too about it starts with self-compassion and boundaries because
Mhm.
I think, it's gonna be hard to hold space for that conversation and to understand somebody else if you're not even giving yourself that same kindness, and I've
Mhm.
noticed, especially over this last year, something that I've been trying to be more intentional about is noticing where I'm at. So rather than going
Mm.
from call to call to call to conversation with my partner, it's like, okay, first, how do I feel going into this conversation? And then if somebody calls me and all of a sudden starts unloading on me, rather than just like allowing that to happen, having a boundary and saying, "You know what? I just need a few minutes. Can I call you back at this time?" Or,
Yeah.
whenever it is. So honoring my own capacity and my own boundaries to be able to hold space for somebody else, because if not, I'm just gonna be easily triggered, irritated, impatient, like wanting to get off the phone, not being able to actually even be supportive.
Mhm.
So, if I want to be present for that, I also need to honor my own boundaries, and that's a process, right? Especially if we're not used to it. We're so used to a lot of people, especially with this virtual and technology and everything, we go from one thing to the other thing to the other thing. We don't even have like time to transition and go for a walk down the hallway to the next meeting. Like there's
Yeah.
literally 0 transition time. So,
Constant. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm. Yeah.
absolutely. So honoring that, and
Yeah.
one other thing you said that I think is really important, you started to talk, I could hear that you were speaking about a framework or a language, so a way to honor somebody's intent while also sharing the impact on you. So,
Mhm.
what's a tool, and I know we teach this a lot when we do workshops, together, so I would love to give this to
Mhm.
the audience as a takeaway. What's a tool that people can use in difficult conversations like that, or when they feel they're entering this type of conversation where there's maybe an overdone strength at play? How can they frame the conversation and go into that and honor both the intent and the impact?
Mhm. Whenever I'm in a conversation with someone and I perceive that it's turned the corner, the conversation has turned the corner. It's become a little bit more, you know, intense in the sense that there's a certain level of emotion to the conversation. Well, automatically the reflex now is to stop, take a deep breath, and then become really focused on seeking to understand. And the framework of seeking to understand is behind everything that people say, there's a reason why they say it. And if I just stopped at the words, I miss out on the reason. And so when listening to somebody, I listened to the what are the facts that they're sharing about that story, right? What are the emotions that are coming up for them? And what's the value or the belief that's not being met? What's something that they feel that they need to defend, right? Let's give you a concrete example. If you say to me, Maddie, whenever I call you these days, you're always in a rush. And the last three times I've called you, you've told me, you know what, I need to go for it. I don't have time for this right now, right? And so there's an emotional component there right now, right? I can see that there's a sense of maybe hurt or there's something there. So when I reflect back to the person, what I hear from those words is the fact is I haven't called, or when you call me, I'm not present, I rush you off. That creates what? That creates frustration in you. Maybe it even hurts you, right? But why does it create frustration and hurt? Is because you value friendship. You really value our friendship. You value connection. So the minute that happens, then for me to now reflect it back to you, I'll start with what you really value, how it makes you feel when that's not there, and what is the behavior that's creating that. So I would turn to you and I would say, so Katrina, I know how much this relationship is important to you, and it's important to me, our friendship. and it's frustrating when you call and I'm not available. So, you know what? I want to apologize for that for you, because my intent is never to be able to rush you off or to not have this conversation. What I need to do, and I'm recognizing, is be a lot more clear around when, because I want to be present for you and I want to give you all my attention. And when I'm preoccupied with something else because I know that I've got a deadline for something, I need to be more mindful of being clearer with you around that, and maybe calling you beforehand and saying, Katrina, I might just have 10 minutes today, but let's go out for dinner tomorrow so that we can really have some time to have the discussions that we love to have. And I think when you demonstrate that level of vulnerability and people feel seen, that you really understood what's causing the level of frustration or whatever else, it brings them back into now saying, okay, you know what? She got me. Okay, I'm good, right? And so we negotiate that. But instead, what if I said to you, "Oh, stop being so sensitive. Like, we've been friends for years. So what? I don't have time to talk to you today. Big deal. We'll talk tomorrow." It would have created a very, very different outcome. So the
Wow. Yep.
framework is listen for the value, listen for the emotion, and then listen for the behavior that's triggering all of that. And then once you reflect it back, acknowledge that for others. And they'll feel seen, they'll feel heard, and most importantly, they'll feel that you understand and that you're human, right? And that you've taken accountability for how your behavior has impacted that person.
Mhm, mhm.
Takes
Yeah, and
practice.
that takes yeah, it's practice and it takes a deep level of understanding because what is important to somebody else might not be important to
To
us.
you.
And
Yeah.
we even define our values differently. So even if, let's say, friendship is a top value for you and it's a top value for me, how we live into that and what that looks like and what the expectations we have or standards of what that is might be different. So even the definition of it. And so being able to have the conversations of, okay, friendship is important to me. This is what it looks like for me. How can we co-create what that looks like for us in the future and really
Mhm.
creating those mutual agreements and
Yeah.
understanding that sometimes come from tension. The
Sometimes comes from
conversations.
tension.
Yeah.
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 I was thinking about that about my son today. My son is 34 today. And, I feel that sometimes I want to be a better, am I that kind of mother that's always in the way? Because now I have a grandson and I don't want to be that pestering kind of mother-in-law that's always calling and, take. So I want to be able to reach out to my son and say, David, I'm really interested in terms of, you from how you define a good relationship or a great relationship with your mother. What does that look like for you? Right? And why not engage in that conversation? And I might hear a few things that I don't want to hear. I might hear a few things that maybe are different from the way I define it. But at the very least, it gives me the opportunity to recognize, to say, this is what you value in this relationship. And then this is what I value. Where does it meet? And where do we need to be mindful? Right? Because your need is expressed in a different way than mine. I need to talk. He doesn't. Right? He's perfectly okay saying everything is good. Right? And I'm going, but that's not enough for me. I need connection. And it's going, well, this is what connection looks like for me. So be happy. And when you start recognizing that connection doesn't look the same, and you start examining your unconscious loop around your story that you've created around that, oh, he doesn't love me. He should love me more. Why does he need to love me? It's me. No, it's not about you. It's about that's how he connects. It might not mean the same way for me, but it does not mean that he's not connecting. Do you see the difference? So that's why I love your podcast so much, because you really deal with bringing consciousness to the unconscious behaviors. What's the
Mhm.
story I'm making up about this? What's the script that I've been carrying for years? What am I missing in the way people express love that I've now imposed that on others, right? It's not their need, it's mine. And so it brings you to a whole different level where you can look at yourself and take and acknowledge your own not shortcomings, but your own unconscious scripts, right? That you can take a look and say, where's this coming from for me? Why is it still there? And can I rewrite it? Not suppress it, but can I rewrite it? Can I rewrite it in a way that empowers him and empowers me at the same time?
Yeah, well, and that example with your son is something that can be taken into everything in life, right? Going into a new team as a leader, asking
For
the people that
sure.
what does a great manager look like for you? Like, what does support look like for you? How can I be of service?
Mhm.
And having that conversation and co-creating that rather than having these assumptions based on what you might want from your leader, because
Exactly.
it could be
Mhm.
2 completely different things.
Mhm.
And so I think that's something that everyone I hope really takes from this, and I encourage everyone to just have a conversation with your partner, your friend, your coworker, your manager, whoever it is, and just say, you know, "What does a great relationship look
Mhm.
like for you? What does partnership look like for you?" And just see where that question in and of itself takes you.
Mhm.
What are your values? How do you define them? These are conversations that can start to bring some of those unconscious assumptions and loops to the surface to really start understanding others, but also start understanding yourself through that conversation. I find that each conversation I have, I learn so much about myself because
Mhm.
through dialogue, I feel like a lot of things that are unconscious come out, like talk therapy. I mean, that's really successful for a reason, right? When you talk, you begin to articulate things from your unconscious that are now becoming conscious because you're connecting all these different dots. And so you just starting conversations, asking questions rather than assuming that, that we're all so similar in the way that we think and perceive and define the world.
And that we carry the same stories, right? The same patterns. And so I, who is it? I don't remember where I heard it, but when we hear about treat others as they would like to, as you would like to be treated, whoever said raise it to the platinum rule instead of the golden rule. And hopefully by, taking consciousness, bringing consciousness to the fact that people are different and they want to be seen for who they are, why not treat them the way that they like to be treated? Which then, again, it's all about the shift in mindset, right? If I'm going to treat somebody that honors who they are as people, then I've got to really be more interested in who they are. I've got to be able to listen to what matters to them. I've got to be able to go beyond the surface and see what's a value that's at play here. What is the strength that they're using here that's not being recognized or that I'm not recognizing? Or what's the strength that I'm using that's having a negative impact on that relationship? And when you put all of that together, slowly but surely, you start building relationships that are grounded in respect and dignity for the other person. And where the person feels that they can, that's a whole basis of psychological safety in a workplace is when people feel included. And inclusivity is not by default. Inclusiveness is, where did I read somewhere the other day that it said, if you're not being inclusive by intent, you're being exclusive by default, right? And so intentionality comes with thinking, comes with bringing that to the surface, examining, rewriting, looking at the scripts that you carry so that you can become a lot more conscious around really truly being inclusive of somebody else's personality, way of thinking, what matters to them.
Yeah. Wow. So powerful. There's so much there.
So much there.
I've heard you say before, don't treat others the way that you want to be treated, treat them the way that they want to be treated. And I just think that's impactful to hear because I think for a long time, especially growing up, I feel like I heard that a lot, like treat everyone as if how you would want to be treated. But
Mhm.
that eliminates our personal experiences and stories and values and
Mhm.
absolutely everything. And so I love, love, love that perspective shift and also the willingness to understand yourself more so that you can understand other people and be curious about them. Because I think the more that we understand ourselves, the more curious and open we are to also understanding other people because we see how complex we are as humans. And so we begin to realize that of course everybody is going to be just as complex in their own way and that invites curiosity, I think, and openness and empathy to other people and their experiences. So
You become a
that
great, great role model for it. And thank you for being a great role model for, for bringing this to your audience and to people because it is not something that is easy to do. It's simple but not easy, right? And so by you bringing this to the surface, it allows people to just, know that there's a different way that we can do this by becoming more aware and more conscious of how we show up to others. You know, choose how you show up in any circumstance by recognizing the impact that you might have on others inadvertently. So
mhm, I love
such an
that.
honor to
Maddie,
be talking to you.
thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Before we go, I know we're just at time. Do you have anything else that you feel like you didn't get to share or any words of inspiration or wisdom that you would want to leave the audience with?
Oh, words of inspiration and wisdom. No, the only thing that I would say is it pays to be kind, and it pays to honor others, because I think if we lived in a world where people feel seen, heard, and understood, and we truly valued listening for what it is intended to do, I don't know. I have hope. I have hope. So, one person at a time, I hope everyone leaves away with knowing that they have such power within them to be able to, shift the way they look at situations that will put them more into their own agency and in their own capability to access what's beautiful about them. So, thank you
Oh,
for the
thank you so
opportunity.
much. So beautiful to end off with that. Thank you, Maddie. It was so great having you here. We'll have to have you back on to
Always.
do other topics. I know we talk so much about crucial conversations and all of these other topics that we'll have to bring you back on, psychological safety, and so more to come.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you again for this lovely conversation.
Like what you heard and want more? Stay connected with our community on social media using the links below. Like us on your favorite podcast provider and sign up for the Conscious Loop newsletter, where we only send you goodies with one intent: to break your unconscious loops. If you have an unconscious loop you want to break free from, let us know so we can feature that loop on the show. Info and show notes, and we'll see you next time in the Conscious Loop.